Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Wandering Road Podcast. I'm your host Chris, and for today's show, I'm joined by my co-host Dean, and today we're going to be talking about the paranormal world, trying to understand what the paranormal world is. What does it mean? What does it mean to him? What does it mean to me? How are you doing today, Dean?
Pretty great, Chris. I'm actually excited for this one because I have to admit that the paranormal world in general is not something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. I find it pretty interesting, but I don't have as much depth of knowledge historically and such about aliens and like I do with aliens and whatnot, like talked about in the past. So pretty excited to unpack this one in a lot of different ways.
Well, you're in luck, my friend, because I love paranormal stuff. I love watching ghost story stuff. I love watching all that crap on Discovery Plus. I've always been a huge fan of the show called A Haunting that's been running since like 1998 or something. But for the sake of today's conversation, the paranormal world, when you hear that term, the paranormal world, what comes to mind to you? Like, what does that make you think of?
So for years, actually, funny enough, you just read me the no kidding definition of it, which I had never heard before. But before you read that to me, when I thought paranormal, I always pictured, like, for instance, the TV shows you're referencing where, like, there's a group of people in a house and it's, what do you call that? Night vision. And they're trying to get kind of like some kind of analysis or detect some kind of presence or whatever, or talk to some kind of ghost or spirit. However, but the way you just read out the definition before we started this was it encompasses anything that is, by definition, paranormal, like outside the range of normal, that what we normally see in life. So that can include anything from like spiritual occurrences to like cryptids, so anything that has to do with the unexplainable. So yeah, that's basically how I understand it now.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I feel the same way in the sense that whatever is unexplainable, like whatever we can't scientifically explain. So for example, like you said, the spiritual stuff, cryptid stuff. One thing that I wanted to dive right into was when you mention paranormal to most people, the first thing they think of is ghosts, possessions, poltergeist, spirituality, all of these different things that quote unquote go with like the paranormal. And one thing that always comes to mind is I'm a person of faith, and you said before that you are a person of faith as well, and trying to reconcile that, the paranormal, with our faith, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. So, well, to be honest with you, I wouldn't say I'm a person of faith, because to me that kind of implies that there's like one ultimate reality that you have to subscribe yourself to, like not necessarily one religion, but that's, so I will say, we talked about this briefly before we got on live or on the mic here, but essentially I grew up in a Catholic family. I was raised to, and it wasn't really a hardcore Catholic family. It was basically go to church, first it was once a week. And then as I got older, it was kind of like once in a while. And then I tried to do that on my own when I got older, because I thought like, hey, Christianity, I was born into it. I know it. It makes sense to me in a way. There were a lot of holes, obviously, growing up. I had a lot of questions that weren't answered, but like I tried to lean into it because, being young and not open to the world and naive a little bit, that's the path. Not saying that people who are, that subscribe to one religion are naive, but just saying that like for me personally, I needed to really get out and explore, because that's just who I am as a person. I found myself more and more as I got older. So I kind of unsubscribed, so to speak, from that one religion mentality. However, I will say that in the world of paranormal, I do think that there is something. Like there has to be, based off of all the experiences, even if it's like mathematically tied to, I don't know, like neutrinos or some subatomic particle that drives these weird connections and occurrences or something at the molecular level or whatever. Even if it's just purely scientific, there has to be something. At the same time, I also have to say, I have to be honest, that I've never truly experienced like a supernatural occurrence like some other people have. I've talked to people who have directly experienced them, so I have some cool stories that I can tell here and there. But for some reason, I just never came across such an occurrence, other than, occasionally I'd have like a weird coincidence happen that, maybe something ended up happening in my life that was good. And it was kind of like, well, was someone kind of watching out for me there? Was someone kind of like leading me in the direction that I needed to go? Because I surely wasn't doing it myself. So like, paths cross and things happen and things work out for the best. And that is very strange. And I do count that as paranormal. How about like on your end? Chris, have you experienced like any paranormal activity or anything that really stood out to you as very strange?
I'll be honest and say that I have experienced quite a bit, but if I go into great detail, we'll probably be here for like 4 hours. What I did want to say about the religion stuff, I grew up Catholic. I'm still Catholic. I noticed that like when I would hang out with my friends growing up, my friends were, of different faiths. We had friends that were Catholic. We had friends that were different denominations of Christianity, friends that were Muslim, friends that were Hindu, family that was Hindu. And I found that most of them kind of didn't believe in like the paranormal and didn't believe in ghosts and that supernatural type of world, right? Whereas for me, it was really different because in my upbringing, like we weren't told that, well, I wasn't told that I wasn't allowed to explore the paranormal. I was basically told like this is a thing and you have to be aware of it. It doesn't mean you have to go looking for it, but you definitely have to be aware of it. But I did want to ask you, because this question just came into my mind. In my experience, I dealt with a lot of folks that were super religious and believed in God, whatever their faith was, very rigorously, practicing every day, etc. But they, on one hand, refused the concept of the paranormal world, the concept of ghosts, hauntings, demons, I might add, or for our Muslim friends out there, jinns. Stuff like that. What are your thoughts on folks like that? And I think you said earlier before we started this podcast today, you mentioned a term to me called cognitive dissonance. Is that an example, or am I not understanding that correctly?
So cognitive dissonance is just generally in the most basic definition. It's basically whenever someone holds two or more conflicting thoughts or ideas or beliefs in their head at one time. And what that term really is attempting to get after is the fallacy, like the kind of like joshing nature of humanity that's funny, which is like we can call something a duck and we can say that it's a duck and claim that it quacks like a duck, but it's clearly a frog, and we see that it's a frog. That's probably not a good example, but it's basically like, I believe that like logically red is the best color, but I also believe that out of a choice of cars of any color, I'm always going to pick blue, even if there's red. It's kind of like two conflicting beliefs at the same time, if that makes sense. So I think there is plenty of that in religion and spirituality that touches on the paranormal as well, because like you just said, there are people out there, and I experienced this too as well growing up. There are plenty of people who they claim to be religious. They go to church, they pray to whatever deity or God that they believe in. They might talk about angels or demons. They might talk about these things as reality. But for my family, it was similar, where they talked about those things, but it was always on the other side of the veil. Like it's just like we're talking about things that are not of this world, that are not in this world. They are for the next world. However, I'm sure that plenty of people who believe that also have heard stories or have people in their lives who experience strange things or paranormal activity or whatever. I personally think that it's kind of like a defense mechanism. And let's not forget that at the very core of people, the psychological nature is driven by fear and desire, not by themselves, but like fear and desire are like pretty big portions of our human nature or whatever. So I think that maybe part of the reason why people who are religious don't like to think about paranormal or claim that it's not for them to think about or dwell on in this reality is because they're afraid of it. But isn't that interesting though, that you can believe that such a thing is possible and it will happen to you eventually when you die, yet you don't want to think about it or dwell on it. For me personally, I I'm not going to pretend like I'm not afraid of things, like things scare me. For instance, like everybody else, death and talking in front of people. With that said, I feel like as I've gotten older, I've gotten more like confident in the ability to look at things from a different perspective and try to break them down. So one thing that I wanted to talk about today, maybe we can talk briefly about it, is as we get older, how do you and I kind of like think about life and what it's made up of, especially in this time period of humanity where we have technology to the degree that we have it. Everyone knows the movie Matrix. So there are all these extra dimensional concepts that exist now in humanity that can overlap with the paranormal, that kind of can either be a theory about it or help explain it. Whereas 2,000 years ago, they didn't have the metaverse. They didn't have, the concept of virtual reality. So all they had was the spiritual side of things. And that was their way of explaining angels and demons or whatever spiritual entity you want to talk about. So nowadays, though, there is like a kind of, to tie it back to cognitive dissonance, there are people nowadays who are totally invested in the technology realm, and they can totally understand and see that it's possible to have virtual reality and chatbots loaded up into virtual reality that mimic human form or whatever, and they have more power, they have more control and power in the virtual realm than we do, or maybe at least they will someday. So if that's the case, like, it's interesting that people who are religious, who are younger, or around our age or younger, who do understand all those things, but yet they can hold both in their head. Like, they know virtual reality exists and it's possible for our reality or our current reality to actually be virtual, like the Matrix or something. At the same time, they totally believe everything they grew up on about religion, whatever religious belief they have, like whatever it is, Muslim, Christian, Hindu, Buddhism, whatever. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, dude, there was something that you mentioned just now. The whole thing about us getting older and religion. I really honed in on that because I'll be honest with you, when I was younger, I would say in my teen years, for some reason I did a 180, right? I kind of became an atheist. I didn't believe in anything. For me, it was all like you were talking about science and like this virtual reality stuff that we have now and technology. For me at that time, I was of the mind of, well, one, if there's a higher power that exists, that created us, that put us on this planet for whatever purpose, how could they allow these horrid things to happen to people, right? And I think that's the number one go-to that people would have when they begin to question their faith, right? How could a genocide happen? How could that be allowed to happen?
Classic thought.
Right. Science. Like, science can explain almost everything. So surely there's a scientific explanation as to why this is going on. But what I will say is that the older I've gotten, the more that I think back to my paranormal experiences, I would say those experiences kind of pushed me back towards religion. Because I was of the mind that, okay, I don't believe in this crap, so it technically shouldn't affect me, right? And I'll give like an experience to you. One day, I was sitting in the living room with my dad and my sister. My mom was at work. I lived in like a duplex type of home. Like, we lived on the top floor. Other family lived at the bottom floor, right? No one else was home downstairs. It was just me, my dad, and my sister. And then there's a knock on our door. 3 distinct knocks, like very loud knocks. I'm like, oh, okay, well, maybe someone came over. I opened the door. There's no one in the hallway. There's no one there. I'm like, okay, whatever. Maybe my cousin is home with his friends and they're playing a prank, right? So we go sit back down. 5 minutes later, it happens again. There's no one there. There's no one home. It's just us 3 in the home. So things like that you can't really explain. I'm like, okay, wind is not going to knock my door and mimic someone knocking the door. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So it's things like that and a multitude of things that have pushed me to the belief in the paranormal world. And I don't want to say like reconcile with my faith, but I believe that strengthened my belief in, I would say, God, or, for everyone else listening, whatever you believe in. Things like that would strengthen it because it makes me think, okay, if this is happening, I don't know what it is. I can't explain it. I can't see it. There could potentially be a counterbalance to that, if that makes sense.
I'm not trying to like tear apart your example, but I'm just interested to find out, and I totally believe you. You know, like you had an experience that was unexplainable, and the only logical explanation you could think of is just something that can't be explained, and kind of touching on the paranormal realm. But it's interesting you said that example further solidified your belief in your religion, and possibly even strengthened your belief in something like a god, like a single god, or the one God. But
yeah, upon retrospection. Yeah, because at the time I was like, I don't know what the hell this is. Right. As like a 12-year-old kid, yeah, you see scary movies and stuff like that, but you really don't have the understanding of it. Right. But when you start to think back, and I talk to my family members, my parents, and then I talk to my aunt, and I talk to my uncle, and I talk to my sister, and I talk to my cousins that have come over and experienced the same thing. And it's like, okay, well, maybe something did happen. But by all means, like, if we want to dissect this, I am completely open to it. If you could prove to me that it was some sort of wind or something, that would make me feel so much better.
No, I believe you, man. I believe that it was something, like, I respect, because I wasn't there. Like, how would I can't possibly know or offer. That's not what I'm trying to do. What I'm just interested in learning more about is like how your perspective on that kind of morphed into a stronger religious belief. Because, like, I mean, it'd be one thing because I mean, there are people, I can tell you all kinds of crazy stories I've heard from other people. For instance, my wife, so she was born in Vietnam. Right. And she came over here when she was 3 years old. So she had a little bit of Vietnamese culture tied in. But like when she got over here, she's pretty much fully Americanized because she grew up over here and whatnot. And same with her brother. But she has family who, like, her aunts and uncles and her mom and dad, they're all first generation, or whatever that proper term is, like, where they actually they grew up in the country and then they came over here. So their English isn't great. They still, like, you know, I think they're very strongly Buddhist. At least some of them are. So very interesting perspective and belief structure and whatnot. So I hear some stories now and then. And one story that is, I asked my wife recently, because I knew we were going to do this podcast today about the paranormal, because I don't have any like super good paranormal stories, but she said that her aunts and uncle, who are now, I think, in their like early 70s, I think like 20 years ago or so, when they were younger, they were in Vietnam. They were visiting some friends or something. I think they were maybe in a hotel or whatever. And they said that they both woke up in the middle of the night and they felt something was wrong. And in the corner of their room was standing a man who was completely burned from head to toe. Like yeah. So like he had flayed skin, and he was just completely like charred, but he was very clearly aware and standing up and looking at them. So here's the thing about stories like that. And I always remain slightly skeptical because, first of all, they're interesting. And I don't doubt for a second that a lot of people have experienced these things and they truly believe them. I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of people out there who are shysters and idiots who are trying to like make stories up to get attention or meet or followers or whatever. But the people who are genuine, that's the first part where I start with, respecting their belief. It's like, okay, these people actually think they saw something. However, we all know that humans are flawed. We all know that humans have all kinds of issues, and we can't trust our senses all the time. And there's such a thing as like, what's that phenomena where like somebody gets sick and then everybody else in the group thinks they're sick, and then it ends up being like a mass hysteria or something like that. So in that story I told you, all you heard was they woke up, they both saw something, and they both agree what they saw. But what you don't hear are the details of the interactions. So if we were just imagining watching a movie and it really was a situation where they just suddenly woke up, the room was cold, they were both cold together, and then they both equally at the same time, without having any dialogue whatsoever, saw a person in the corner of the room. However, let me flip to another, like a really quick, similar example. My wife and I, we sleep in the same bed, obviously, in our bedroom. And my wife a few months ago said, I'm a little bit creeped out because at nighttime, I wake up and I think I see a shadow, like of a man or something, standing over me. I'm like, okay, that's weird. But then like a week ago, I'm laying in bed and we turn out the lights and we're just kind of like talking, getting ready for bed. And I look over in the corner and I see that there's a shadow cast on the wall, that it kind of looks like the outline of a person. and it's standing right over her bed. So when you're half awake, like I'm sure her aunt and uncle were, there at least could be other options to explain away what happened. And maybe one of them said they saw something. Let's say hypothetically one of them came out of their sleep and they were having some kind of sleep hallucination or sleep paralysis, right? And there was a shadow in the corner of the room that looked like a person. So their brain superimposed this image of someone who was burned because maybe they grew up during the Vietnam War and the horror stories of napalm and all that stuff. And then maybe one of them told the other one, "Oh my God, there's someone in the corner of the room who is burned." And then they fit that image in their memory because maybe it only lasted a few seconds. Right. So I don't want to go down too much of a rabbit hole with this, but basically what I'm getting at with it, I always think that it's important to remain skeptical about what these stories entail and more importantly, what pieces of information are missing. Because like I said, if you capture this on video, which I know there are plenty of supernatural instances that are supposedly captured on video, that's different. But when you hear like second, third order stories, I think it's always important to have some kind of skepticism involved. After hearing that story, does it make you think about your past experiences in a different light? Are you pretty like sure still that all those experiences are very paranormal?
So what's interesting about that story is you said that they both woke up and they kind of saw the same thing. So that right there, saying they both see the same thing, yes. I would be kind of curious as to what, like you said, there's missing details. Who said what to who, right? Did right. Did the husband wake up the wife and say, "Hey, there's like a dude that's like burnt standing in the corner there. Do you see it?" And in your half awake state, half asleep state, right? You'd be like, "Oh shit, I do see it." So that's I'm not denying what they saw. Yeah. Because if you look at paranormal stories from Asia in general, they are fucking wild. And they have some spirits that you don't want to fucking run into if those things exist. They are absolutely terrifying. They're more terrifying than your quote unquote Christian demons. But I digress. Back to their story. Like you said, I would have a hint of skepticism as well. I always have a hint of skepticism when someone's telling me their story, right? Mm-hmm. Because when I listen to a scary story or a ghost story that someone's sharing with me, I do it because firstly, I want to be freaked out. Like how
that's
creepy.
Fun.
Yeah, it's fun. It's absolutely fun. And then you start thinking like, okay, what could it possibly be? The only thing that gives this some sort of validity is that they both saw the same thing and I don't know if they described it both in the same manner. Right. That I think that would give it some validity. But if they both said they saw the same thing, but one said they saw a woman and one said they saw a man, and it's like, okay, who's bullshitting here? Who like is still in their dream state, which is a thing. Like you can wake up. If you wake up suddenly and from a dream and you don't fully wake up from your dream state, your brain will project those images to your eyes.
I've seen like giant spiders like descending over me like the size of a frying pan when I wake up from my dream, and clearly they're not there. But yeah, absolutely, I agree with you.
Yeah, like on your previous, like a couple of episodes ago, you talked about like seeing Chucky and like lizard people and hearing a rattlesnake. Right. So I don't know what their background was. I don't know what their experience was with the war at the time. If they were around people that suffered from, the napalm bombings or anything like that. It could definitely be a thing where if they both experience that, their collective like minds, I'm not trying to say they have psychic abilities, but it's like, okay, I see that. Do you see that too? And I feel like with human beings, we want to be validated along with other people. We don't want to be the black sheep and be like, well, I don't fucking see anything. What the hell are you talking about? So that's the only thing that would come to mind. But for my experiences, everything that I experienced was not from a sleeping state. It was like, awake. Dude, it was fucking, I was wide awake and half of the time it was in broad daylight. Mm. And I'll give you one example that if I text my mother right now and I ask her what happened to Aunt Blah that day, where like what happened to Aunt Blah in that house, she would immediately respond back to me, "Oh, when the ghost or spirit or whatever tossed her into the fucking closet door."
Oh, jeez.
Dude, I swear,
Yeah.
I swear on my grandparents that they're not around anymore.
Yeah,
I swear on them that
No, I
my,
believe
my
you.
aunt. So picture this. You have the like say you're standing in the kitchen, right? And you're looking directly forward, and then there's like a kind of like a rectangular squarish hallway to the direct, like if you walk through that hallway, you stop in the middle of the hallway, you hang a left, a 90-degree angle left. That's the door to the bathroom. Directly right behind you would be the door to the little closet. To your right slightly would be one door to the bedroom, and then your other right, like if you move slightly, like you angle a little bit further to the right. I'm not good with degrees and stuff like that. Bear with me.
No, I'm following.
I hope I'm painting a picture. Yeah,
you are, but I'm the reason I kind of snicker there was because I'm thinking about like what if a ghost was just trying to get past your aunt to get to the bathroom? It's like, oh, I gotta take a ghost shit. Get out of the way.
Like scary movies, I would think. Like move.
Get out the way, bitch.
Right? So just picture that. She's standing in the middle of the hallway. She walks to the bathroom door. This is in the winter time. So like I don't know if your parents did this, but like we would always put plastic over the windows to like keep the heat insulated in the house.
I remember that. Yeah.
So all the windows are covered in plastic. There's no wind drafts. There's nothing, right? So she opens the door and she steps foot into the doorway, and then she just literally goes like gets shoved backward into the closet door. And we're like, what the fuck was that? I saw it. My mom saw it. My sister saw it. My aunt experienced it. So here's 4 people standing there. Like it was literally like 1 o'clock in the afternoon on like a Saturday. And it's like, what the hell just happened? So like, it's one of those things that I can't explain. Like if you have an explanation for it, by all means, it would make me feel better.
I can't possibly conceive of anything that would, where all those people were looking, and that's what I'm talking about. And I totally, like I said, I believe there is something more to our reality than we know. I think the problem comes from humanity trying to fill the gaps of information and understanding, where we get in trouble and we kind of separate ourselves from others, where it's like, no, that was a demon. No, that was an angel. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, no, that was some kind of like cloaked alien. It's just like there's so many ways to explain what happened on a paranormal side in addition to trying to explain it away. So, but I just want to say real quick, I think that the most important thing to always keep a pagan with stories like this is the human factor, where, like you said, you these stories are interesting. I mean, the whole reason you created, say, this podcast where you talk about stuff like this is because you find it interesting, and because it's unknown and it's something you want to pick apart and understand. And I'm sure it's the same reason why a lot of people eventually, hopefully, will listen to your podcast more and more, because it kind of like incorporates this human perspective on what we find fascinating about things we don't know in reality. So, I mean, we can sit here and talk about stories until we're like blue in the face. But one thing I wanted to talk about, go back to really briefly, was this concept of spirituality, paranormal activity, and religion. So in particular, one thing that we didn't talk about in depth too much was when you have a spiritual belief and you believe in the whatever holy text you have or whatever, there are components from ancient times that include explanations about those deities, those spirits, angels, demons, or whatever they're called, jinn in other religions, in Islam and other religions and whatnot. However, we have this new concept of ghosts that can be our loved ones, right? Like,
right.
I'm sure back in the day, I'm sure there were plenty of stories about people telling ghost stories about loved ones coming back and visiting them and stuff. But you don't hear that too much in history, do you? And I have to wonder, maybe it's just I don't know enough about history, and maybe, you being a historian and whatnot can shed some light on that. But when I always think back to that, I never really hear or think about stories of loved ones. Whereas today, that is one of the explanations that we hear. It's like, oh no, it was my great aunt who passed away, who sent me a sparrow or a yellow bird or something, who was her favorite kind of bird. And I've heard stories like that from people where someone died, and then like a day later, this bird that they used to love came to their windowsill and sat there, and they've never seen that happen before. And to me, that's not as cool and interesting as seeing a ghost or something. But to me, that counts as paranormal activity. I think I'm more interested as I get older in stories like that, because that implies that there's either a continuation of the person's conscious being after they die, or there's some kind of good, caring, loving spirit who knows that we're suffering from the loss of a loved one, and it's letting us know that that person is with them on the other side or something like that. Or it can just be, some asshole demon who's making us think that things are all good. And you know what I mean? Like there's all kind of different ways to play, but I like to think about the more positive aspect. So what do you think about stories like that, where it's like people are sending you signs and signals from the other side? And how do you interpret that? I mean, I know historically speaking, we've seen like back in the 1800s, like people who were trying to pull one over for money, they would have these fake seances and whatnot, and they would set up these elaborate things that made it seem like someone was coming. And even nowadays, like not to go back to South Park, but there's that one episode where
with the Suons, where they're suing people.
No. Okay, that was equally funny. But the one I'm thinking about, maybe it was the same episode, but it was the one where they went to remember that guy who used to do The Other Side or whatever. I forget his name. I think he was found out to be a fraud at some point, but there used to be a TV show where they would have people come on and he would like do these broadcast readings of people in the room. Do you remember the show at all?
I know
vaguely,
the concept, but
okay.
The closest thing I could think of is Miss Cleo. You remember Miss Cleo? Yeah.
I remember Miss Cleo, man. Yeah,
call me now.
Oh, God, I remember that. I can't believe it. She's probably not even around anymore.
No, I think she passed away a few years ago.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah.
But this guy in South Park, they were making fun of this real guy. I'll have to look up his name later. But essentially, it was basically like, he's standing in front of the audience. He's like, I'm getting something. I'm hearing. I think it's like a ba. It's like a huh. It's like a cuh. And then like someone like finally it connects to someone. Oh, Kevin, my Kevin. And it's like
right.
He's just reaching but anyway. So I think there's stuff like that. And then nowadays there's also, and in the last few hundred years, there's been stories more and more about people who had these beautiful experiences where, some animal or some thing came across their path that doesn't usually cross their path that their recently deceased loved one used to love or talk about. And do you have any stories like that? And what is your perspective on that sort of paranormal? It's like less interesting, more beautiful side of paranormal activity.
Well, when it comes to animals crossing my path, I tend to come across a lot of snakes when I go jogging, so I don't know what that means.
The devil.
I don't know what that means for me.
The devil's sending you signals, son.
I know, right? That voice just reminds me of that movie Little Nicky with Adam Sandler, but I digress from that. Yeah. Such a great movie. I did want to answer your question about the concept of ghosts throughout history.
Yeah.
And it's not just a thing like in the 1800s. Like if you look in the Old Testament, there are ghosts there.
Like of loved ones, of individuals?
Oh gosh, whose ghosts do they summon? I think was it the ghost of Samuel? I guess Saul goes to like, I don't know, some sort of like witch or fortune teller or psychic, and then asked to talk to the ghost of Samuel.
Man, that's so fascinating.
Yeah, and this is in the Old Testament.
Yeah, exactly. And please finish your thought. Just remind me to go back on this because I have an interesting thing that I want to ask, but go ahead.
Sure. But to continue with like the concept of ghosts in history, the ancient Greeks had concepts of ghost. The ancient Romans, like ghosts were very much a thing. That the ancient Romans believed that lemures were these restless spirits of the dead, and they were often seen as vengeful or malevolent, and they were thought to cause harm or disturbances to the living. And it kind of reminds me of that type of ghost that I don't know if it's I can't remember what Asian country it is. I think it might be in Japan. In order for the ghost to be appeased, you would have to like leave it gifts and offerings and stuff like that. So even across the world, the ancient Romans, they had no contact with the ancient Japanese or even anything like that. And they have similar types of beliefs. So the belief in the paranormal and spirits and ghosts is very much a thing. But the one thing I want to say, a comment that I want to make is I believe in the paranormal and the supernatural. I believe there are certain things that we can't explain, that science can't explain. But I also want to ask the question, why the hell don't we see like ancient Roman ghosts? You know what I mean?
They're too busy having orgies. That one Simpsons episode where like the guy got stabbed, the Roman got stabbed. He's like, I wish I went to more orgies. And then he died.
Oh, I
That's, like,
remember
one of my
that. I
favorite-
remember that episode. Oh, the Simpsons.
Yeah.
Back to that question.
Yes. So on that, I don't know, but like one thing that's kind of tied to that question, which you brought up, which I find fascinating, is this idea that there are different religions and different people who have no contact with each other historically, or like back then they had no contact, yet they have similar stories. I think that you could argue both sides to that. You can say, oh, wow, look at this as an example of, this is an indicator that there is some higher truth to existence that is shared among all people in the supernatural level. However, I would argue that it's possible to go the opposite route, which is we all come from similar ancestors. I think what is like, I don't know if this is true or not, but like sometimes I hear like science claims that all people who have blue eyes descended from like one person, like, or like one ancient human being or whatever. So it's like, I think that's equally possible, where it's like, yeah, these civilizations, they rose and fell and on their own, and they had no connection with each other, yet they have similar stories. But that might just speak to the fact that our roots and how we develop as people, regardless of what we look like on the outside, like we all have basic needs. We all have basic feelings of like love and hate and all these other emotions. And maybe that concoction over time, even though we're separated in different cultures and we ultimately have different, we come to different conclusions about reality, we have these similar underlying experiences. So I just wanted to make that point that you can argue both sides of that coin, I think, equally well. But the other thing that I wanted to jump back to, which I find fascinating, that just really like blew me away, was this idea, like you were saying in the Bible, was it Saul was trying to raise the ghost of Samson, you said?
Samuel.
Okay. So see that, I find that fascinating, because you said that in the Old Testament, he went to this like clairvoyant, supernaturally linked individual who presumably, I don't know, maybe they were, because in the Old Testament, that's talking about Judaism, right? Because Judaism came, correct me if I'm wrong, but that the Old Testament was like basically the Torah, right?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, so that is interesting to me, because that they believe. I apologize to anybody if I get this wrong, but like, so the Jewish people, Judaism back then, still believed in one God, basically. That person that they went to see was either Jewish herself or himself, or whoever the person who was trying to raise the dead. They were either Jewish or they weren't Jewish, and they had some spiritual belief outside of Judaism. Yet it's still, in either case, it doesn't seem like it belongs in the structured religion of Judaism, and it certainly doesn't belong in the structured religion of, like, say, Christianity today. Because, like, if you're like a really devout Christian, I think from what I've experienced talking to people like that who are really hardcore, they don't believe in that sort of thing. And that goes back to the same concept of like cognitive dissonance. How do you maintain this belief that there are people who are outside your religion who can somehow control the lifeline or the connection between the living and the dead, yet you yourself believe that is not the path that you should be following to be like that person, yet that person is closer to the spiritual realm than any other person, supposedly. So that, I just find that fascinating, that you have a story in the Bible that came from the Old Testament, which, was the Torah, is talking about people trying to communicate with the dead, when I think some sects of Judaism believe that once you're dead, right? Like I may be wrong about that, but like some sects believe that like when you're gone, you're dust. Like that's it. So for them to try to contact and then claim that they did raise that person and communicate with them, what does that mean about the nature of reality and the nature of religion? And we can make that argument all the way back thousands of years ago and still have it hold up today. So I just find that what you brought up is just absolutely so interesting. I just had to get that out.
Yeah, and the person that Saul goes to consult is labeled the Witch of Endor. And
Okay, so she's a witch. Okay.
Yeah, she's a witch. And Saul basically promises her that, like, hey, we're not going to harm you or anything like that if you do this for me. Essentially, all of this happens in the first book of Saul in the Old Testament. And Saul, essentially what Saul wants to do is to consult Samuel before he goes into battle against the Philistines. Now, eventually, Saul loses the battle. They are defeated, and he kills himself on his sword. So he commits suicide.
Yeah.
I don't know if we want to talk about a moral of that story is essentially don't try to conjure the dead and don't speak to witches or anything of that sort because they could be lying to you. It could have been some sort of like demon or something. Because have you ever heard of the Ring of Solomon or the Seal of Solomon?
I have heard that. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was a ring or seal, depending on what you want to call it, that allowed Solomon to control demons and use them as slaves. So again, we have another story within the Old Testament. And I believe this might be in the Quran as well.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the stories, they're shared between both books, the Old Testament and the Quran, for those of you that are not aware. Just the names that are different. I think in the Quran they call Solomon Suleiman, I believe. I think that might be the Arabic name for him. And in the Quran, instead of calling it demons, it says that he controls like an army of jinn that allows him to build these magnificent structures. So even in those ancient texts, we have the concept of the supernatural and the paranormal world. So one could say even throughout our entire history, this has been a constant thing that, we can't really explain what it is. So until science can explain what it is, I think that will be our natural drawback, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And then going, this is probably going to terrify everybody because like this idea always terrified me, but that you brought this idea back into my head, which is the idea that the supernatural can somehow be manipulated by evil spirits or something like that make it seem like we're experiencing some connection to a former loved one, when in reality, it's purely just a demon. So to me, that is absolutely terrible. Because think about it from like how limited we are as people. Any type of nature of reality could be true, and we wouldn't know it. I know that I hesitate to bring this up because it's such a really dark. You could feel free to cut this out if you want, but like that story we were talking about before, where there are people who are ultra militant within a certain religion. I won't, it's not worth bringing up, but just in a certain religion, they were ultra militant, and they believe that everybody else around them was created by the Creator for the sole purpose of either being destroyed by themselves or being destroyed by the followers of that faith, or eventually God will come down and smite them all and send them all to hell forever. And that's their only purpose in life, is that. So when I think of terrifying concepts of reality like that, and I marry that up with the story of how there's all these cases in history about how people claim that, demons are mimicking the spirits of the loved ones that we try to call back or whatever. Again, hopefully not, but totally within the realm of possible. And not saying I believe it, but just saying like, that's, can't explain that away. It's really hard to explain anything like that away because we are so disconnected and disjointed from the true nature of reality in general as human beings, and we can't prove anything. So I think that that's equally terrifying in the paranormal realm, where it's like, how do you know these stories, these beautiful, lovely stories of people coming to visit you, aren't just like mimic forms of some other being that is copying the person that you once loved or whatever? I sincerely apologize to anybody who doesn't want to hear that, because maybe they really do believe it, their loved ones came back and visited them. But just for the sake of conversation, that was, the thought was generated from you talking about the Old Testament example of Saul and whatnot. So how do you think about, like, you being Catholic and you still believing in the true nature being, some kind of Christian belief or whatever, in reality and your loved ones are the other side. What do you think about it? How do you feel when you hear something like that is possible?
So the way that I see it is in this way. I don't. It's kind of hard to explain, but I'll say this first. You don't need to apologize for your opinion. Like, this is what we're here for. We're here to have analytical, logical, philosophical discussions. You know what I mean?
Right.
So if anyone feels offended by that, too bad. Too bad. No, honestly, too bad. Because in order for us to grow mentally and in order for us to grow as human beings, we need to have these discussions. And
totally agree.
You know, being the type of person that is so close-minded that you're going to get upset over someone asking a question. What does that say about your security in yourself and in what you believe? But I digress.
That's true.
But
That's true.
Back to what you asked, like the whole concept of people saying like, oh, well, my grandmother came to me, or this person came to me, or that person came to me. I don't know how to feel about it. And the reason I say that is because I've watched so many like paranormal documentaries about people that have played with Ouija boards trying to contact their relatives and whatnot. And then all hell breaks loose. Not trying to say like hell specifically is coming for them, but but like
stuff goes down.
Stuff starts happening. So that's why I'm glad you brought that up. The whole thing about that guy talking about, you know, trying to be that psychic, right? I'm not trying to like piss off any psychics or anything like that.
Yeah.
But there are people in my family that are sensitive. Some have a sixth sense, and I never really understood why when I was young. It was one of those things like, Mom, I don't understand why, Mom. Like, I don't see anything. But like when you listen to their perspective, it's like, okay, they see things. I don't mean to kind of go off on like a rant or anything like that, but it makes it makes me think about what my cousin said in a previous podcast that I had with him, where my cousin is a Hindu, and he talked about the paranormal and the spiritual world within the perspective of a Hindu. And they say in his beliefs, there are multiple planes of existence. So does that mean that there are multiple planes of existence that we just call the paranormal world that we can't see? I feel like I didn't answer your question with regards to the people saying that that's their aunt or someone. I personally think that if someone crossed over already, they're not going to come just to help you make a decision on a job. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I feel like that's something that you have to do on your own.
No, dear, get that bagel, not the other one, or something like that. You know, like it's something like, who would come back for that? Right? Like, you know, something so menial.
Yeah. Like you said, we're not trying to offend anyone, but it's one of those things. It's like, if God is sending back your loved one to assist you with something, I feel like it would be really a drastic life change. Not, oh, I need to do this thing on this certain day.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And if I can just say really quickly too, like this whole concept about, like you said, you said it was your mom who has like the interesting feelings and whatnot or whatever. It was your mom, right? Not your aunt?
Yeah. It's my mom. Like, my mom will walk into a place and say, like, I don't like it here. The energy's off and wouldn't want to be there. When my parents went house hunting to purchase their home, like, my mom would be like, no, not this place.
I think there could be something to that because, and I'll tell you why, because a good example just happened to me literally yesterday so I actually work from home most of the time, right? So I sit in the same spot, the same desk. I have the same AC unit blowing behind me to the same degree. All these factors are the same, right? And it's just me in this room as I'm working throughout the day. And then obviously things change when my wife comes home or my daughter comes upstairs or whatever. 2 days ago, I'm sitting at my desk finishing up work and my wife is home early. And I didn't know what she was doing. She was in the room somewhere. And then suddenly I just felt like something was different in the room. And I turn around and my wife is just like like she's just joking around. She's just like staring at me with a creepy smile. But she's like, you know, right over my shoulder on our bed behind us and just like, you know, smirking at me. And I thought about that. I'm like, well, I I felt her presence behind me, and I felt something was strange, because she could have just been in the bed away from me, like on her phone, like she does most of the time, or a lot of the time when she's in the room. So I just had this feeling like something was different, and I couldn't see her reflection, couldn't detect anything else other than that feeling. So I turned around, and lo and behold, she was right behind me with a creepy smirk, just playing a prank, right? But the point is, was that something, was there something deep in me, the connection I have with my wife, where like I felt like something was like different than usual, where it was kind of like paranormal, supernatural? Or was it maybe just the fact that even though I couldn't hear her, I could feel that the air unit behind her wasn't blowing through onto me like it usually does, and that was my way to pick up on the difference in the room that freaked me out and made me turn around. So I have to wonder if it's the same thing, because you and I, like, we follow like science and technology and stuff. So I'm sure you've heard this whole concept of like I mentioned earlier in the podcast, where science has come really close to proving, or maybe has already proved, like maybe one subatomic particle that is linked through space time can have an effect on another particle that is like light years away from it, and have an effect on it instantaneously. So I wonder, like, maybe do we have some kind of connection or way to interpret that in our brains, or maybe neurons firing in a certain way, that some people have an ability to read things like your mom more so than other people? And how does that fit into spirituality? I don't know. What do you think about that? Is that like something that you might believe in, that it's more like scientifically linked to us? Or do you think it really is unexplainable to our degree of understanding?
Well, from the scientific perspective, I'll say this. I think some of us are more in tune with different parts of our brain than others.
Mm-hmm.
And we only use like 5% of our brain. If
I think it's 10%. Yeah, 10%. And it's not just one portion of our brain that's 10%. It's we constantly use all of our brain, but it's only 10% sections at a time. And if you were ever to use up to, like, I think the number is like 40 or 50% or something, if you were somehow to activate 40 or 50% or more of your brain at once, you would just die, because your body wouldn't be able to self-regulate itself. Anyway, yeah.
Right. So going off of that, I may be completely wrong or completely butchering this. I think that people that are more susceptible to quote unquote the paranormal or the supernatural, look at me turning into a skeptic for the sake of this point, right?
I gotcha.
Right?
I gotcha. No, I'm just kidding.
I mean, you kind of have to put on multiple hats when you talk about this stuff. Is it within the realm of possibility that if they analyze someone that was, let's say if they took two people, right? Someone that says that they have a sixth sense, they could see things, they could feel things, they could feel energies, and someone that doesn't, and they like hook up their, like, all this stuff to do like analysis on their brains, and they show like different parts of their brains are working, right? That the other person doesn't, for some reason, their brain doesn't tap into, if that makes any sense. Yeah, I think from a scientific perspective, that could potentially be the case. Could the paranormal world, like the Hindus think, be a dimension that we can't see? But some people, for one reason or another, whether due to that particle that you mentioned, have more of a connection to it?
I mean, and also think about it from that idea from an evolutionary perspective. I mean, I know some people who are religious don't believe in evolution. They believe that, whatever force created us a certain number of years ago, and anything before that is a lie. But if you subscribe to the idea of evolution, and you also subscribe to the idea that science has pretty closely or at least somewhat accurately estimated the age of modern humans, you're talking about what, like 40, 50,000 years of evolution. And if you also throw in the curveball of this idea, like in the last episode we talked about, like aliens, where some people who believe in aliens, they believe that they evolved so much that they are capable of like kinetic, or what's that called, where it's like kinesis, telekinesis. Yeah. Like so that in itself is maybe another example. It doesn't have to be necessarily technological. It could just be that they either found out a way to accelerate their evolution, or they actually did evolve over a crazy long period of time, like 1 million years or whatever. So maybe there is something where, as we get more integrated into technology and as we adapt our brains to that mode of thinking, maybe we'll see, all these movies are coming out now where like it's like, oh, some portions of human beings or human civilizations create superpowers like X-Men or something. Like there's a subset of people who have these abilities who live amongst regular people who don't have such abilities. So maybe that's something we'll continue to see as evolution unfolds, that obviously you and I aren't going to see, because that, we're talking about like 1,000 years plus in the future. But
Right.
maybe we'll see that more and more. And if that is how things work, and you can also argue the other way, can't you? Like you can also argue that maybe there's atrophy in that capability. Maybe people 1,000 years ago or more were way more in tune with that sort of thing than they are today, and we're actually going in the opposite direction. So who knows like how that plays out, if it's even a thing, if it's purely scientific, if there's a separation between science and, like you said, your cousin with the multi-plane concept of religion. There's all different ways to think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. There definitely is. And this wasn't on our agenda to talk about today, but I wanted to ask you about people that have or claim to have near-death experiences and that they say they see the afterlife. What are your thoughts on that in general? I mean, we could have an entire like separate podcast on this stuff.
Yeah, maybe that can be the next one, but that's actually a really good one. I can already think about like millions of different ways to just talk about that, but in a nutshell, I do think that it's very interesting in the sense that the people who do explain the things that are happening around them. I'm thinking about this one story I heard years ago from I think it was just, who knows if it was true or not, but it was one of those stories that like popped up in a news article or on TV or something. And someone was talking about how they were clinically dead or something, or they were dying, and they were wheeled into an operating room, and they suddenly felt themselves levitating above their body, and they could look down on their own body and see themselves being operated on. And they didn't feel any pain or anything, but they just they watched the things happening to their body below them. What I find fascinating about that is twofold. So first one is some of these stories, people claim they could hear the doctors talking, and maybe there are even some cases where, people heard the doctors saying certain things that, or better yet, seeing them do certain things that they wouldn't themselves have been able to see. Because you can argue, like if someone's unconscious and they're being worked on and they can hear the doctor, maybe their brain remembers it in a different way. But if the actual visual perspective is different because their eyes are closed on the gurney and they don't see things going on beyond, their closed eyelids. So I think there might even be some stories of people like looking down on themselves and like claiming they see doctors doing certain things, and then having that being confirmed later through whatever means, like, talking to the doctor or if there's any kind of video recording. But the thing I find fascinating is there's also the other end of that perspective, which is maybe our brains, like you said, we only use 10% of our brains at any given time. Maybe in the final throes of death, the brain just fires everything at once to try to survive. And part of that firing of everything trying to survive is just completely opening up all the apertures, all the floodgates of every possible depth of sense that the human being can possibly take in order to try to figure out a way to survive. So it's very possible that it's not supernatural where our soul, quote unquote soul, is leaving our body. Can you imagine a situation where your brain is firing in such a way where it's so powerful, because it's basically a giant supercomputer, where it's calculating every single reverberation of sound, and it's like basically like a bat. It's creating a virtual image of the room in your head, and it's giving you a conscious perspective of that entire room based off of everything that's flying into your brain from your other senses in order for you to try to find a way to survive. But when you die, that's it. Like, it's just lights out, because like you failed to find, your brain failed to find a way to survive and ultimately had to give out. I think that is possible. And that to me is equally interesting compared to the idea that maybe there's some kind of spiritual side where when we die, we actually do leave our body and we go up to the stars or whatever, the heaven or whatever like that. So what do you think about that perspective? Do you think that it's possible that it's just purely a defense mechanism or survival mechanism for our brains firing all at once? Or are you more in the camp of believing that it's actually spiritual?
I am conflicted, to be honest with you. I want to think that, like you said earlier in the podcast, that, most of us are terrified of death. but it's inevitable. Like we're all going to pass one day. And the whole concept of like once you die that it's lights out is really terrifying. I'm a little conflicted. I would like to think that even if there isn't like a heaven or hell or a Hades or Sheol or whatever you want to call it, right? I would be more comfortable in the notion that the soul, like being we're energy, and the concept is that energy can't die.
Yeah. Yeah.
That our energy then moves on to somewhere else, if that makes sense. Right. I think that would make the most logical sense. That would make the most scientific sense, as opposed to, you just die and it's just lights out. Because if that is the case, then it's like you could ask the question, what the fuck is the purpose? Why are we here? You know what I mean?
This is getting it. I mean, I love this kind of conversation because it's getting into a very heavy realm of humanity that people don't want to think about and talk about, but something that I've spent many, many years of my own life thinking about. I mean, I used to have this more and more, or more so when I was younger, but I still have this occasionally where I do have like a waking gasp of, like realization where, I was unconscious and now I'm conscious again. And somehow in that instance, I am aware that someday I'm not going to exist. And I do have those I don't know if it's, I'm sure
many panic attacks.
Yeah. It's like a mini panic attack where you wake up and and all at once a flood of thought, my daughter, my wife, myself, my parent, like whoever, like it's all going to go away. And in that moment of coming back to consciousness after sleep, occasionally I'll have that like, oh my God, like realization. And I don't know if other people, hopefully, I mean, it's kind of like scary. Like I don't want, people to be scared or feel it. I'm sure people feel it, but like, it's not something I would wish on other people to experience. Luckily I don't experience it as much anymore.
Right.
But I, here's the thing though, man, it's so hard to admit this and say it out loud. Everybody changes throughout their life. And if you impose that onto the concept of humanity and evolution, every living thing evolves to our belief and understanding. So any state that we find ourselves in this time period within the last even 5-10 years maybe, and then compare that to humanity for the last 1,000, 10,000 years or whatever, we are wholly different than we were 10 years ago. We are not wholly, but like largely different than we were 10 years ago. Humanity is largely different now than it was 10,000 years ago. So the actual idea that we will somehow persist in the state of being that we are now is highly unlikely, because that's just not nature. That's just not how things work. So even if we did, continue on after we die, I mean, if you're talking about eternity, what's that going to look like? And I talked about this to people who are ultra religious. If you die when you're 3 years old and you were baptized, like say Christianity, like some people believe in Christianity where you don't get to go to heaven unless you're actually physically baptized in the name of Christ.
Right.
And accept Christ in your heart. So what does that look like for a baby who was 3 years old, who was baptized and then ends up dying? Will they continue to grow in the afterlife? What does that mean? I mean, if they are taken out of the realm of humanity, how will they possibly grow up like humans? Will there be a completely different sect in heaven where the people who died when they were in their infancy grow up in heaven and they look completely different from people who grew up on earth? And will they hang out? Will they understand each other? And then how will those beings in heaven grow and evolve? Because presumably it's a time-based thing where you're still yourself. So that's what I'm saying, is like the point is, no matter what we do, whether we die and we're gone, or we evolve or we ascend to a higher plane of existence, there's gonna be a change. We're not gonna be the same way we are now. And in that sense, there's always gonna be death. Either the self is going to die physically and be gone, or the self as it exists in terms of psychology and makeup in terms of belief or whatever is going to change, and that itself can be death. So death of the current person that they are now. So I think as soon as humanity realizes that there's going to be change, and change is, death is just change, then we can just embrace it and try to do the best we can moving forward. And that's what I really believe, man.
Thanks for tuning into today's episode of The Wandering Road. You can find us on Apple, Google, Spotify, and most podcast platforms. Be sure to subscribe and share. Also, don't forget to give a follow on Instagram at twroadpodcast and follow my TikTok at twrpodcast. Take care, and I'll catch you on the next one.